Thomas Eriksen from the University of Oslo. Professor Eriksen is a world-renowned expert in the field of globalization. He's a social anthropologist by training, and he has very many things of interest to say to us on one of the most pressing topics, or many of the most pressing topics of our time. So, once again, I'd like to welcome him to the University of Oslo. Thank him for giving generously of his time. He has a full program in the next day and a half. He's going to be working very hard, and I hope that you will feel a relaxed atmosphere and be able to put questions to him and respond to the things that he has to say in a more or less free and open manner. Okay? So, without more ado, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to present you.
Yes.
Okay, to our audience. So, good morning to all. Thank you for being here. And I have to start to thank Professor Thomas that kindly accepted our invitation to work, which is not a good invitation. But we hope we can have some pleasure also with him and going around Aveiro. Professor Thomas Hylland Eriksen is a Norwegian anthropologist. He's currently a professor of social anthropology at the University of Oslo, as Professor Barker pointed, as well as the 2015-2016 president of the European Association of Social Anthropologists. He is a member of the Norwegian Academy of Science and Letters. He was born in Oslo and has done fieldwork on Trinidad and Mauritius. His fields of research include identity, nationalism, globalization, and identity politics. Professor Thomas finished his PhD degree in 1991 and was made professor in 1995 at the age of 33. From 1993 to 2001, he was editor of the journal something, I don't know what it means, but it's something.
It means contemporary times.
Okay, contemporary times.
Cultural journal.
Okay. A considerable portion of his work was focused on popularizing social anthropology and conveying basic cultural relativism as well as criticism of Norwegian nationalism in the Norwegian public debate. He has written the basic textbook used in introductory courses in social anthropology at most Scandinavian universities. The book, Small Places, Large Issues, in English, is also used in introductory courses in many other countries and has been widely translated as his other major textbooks, such as Ethnicity and Nationalism, Anthropological Perspectives. Professor Thomas Eriksen is a frequent contributor of newspapers in Scandinavia. Professor Thomas has been a political candidate for the Norwegian Liberal Party. In the local election of 2011, he was a candidate for the Norwegian Green Party in Oslo. He was also a candidate for the Norwegian Green Party in 2013 general election. Between 2004 and 2010, Professor Thomas Eriksen directed an interdisciplinary research program, Cultural Complexity in the New Norway, Kulkom, at the University of Oslo. In a programmatic statement, he said that the main goal was, I quote, redraw the map of Norway to make it fit in the new transnational, complex and globalized realities. A book which sums up the empirical results and theoretical perspectives resulting from Kulkom is Samfund, which means society.
Yes.
I know, because it was written. One quote from Eriksen made in the context of his Kulkom involvement has become a focal point in the 1,500-page manifesto of Anders Behring Breivik, the perpetrator of the 2011 Norway attacks, as well as in Breivik's defense speech during his 2012 trial. Professor Thomas has also been a frequently interviewed commentator of the trial of Breivik. I think you all know what we are talking about the grave attack in Oslo. Professor Thomas Eriksen has also been called as a defense witness. In 2011, Professor Eriksen was awarded an advanced grant from the European Research Council under the heading Overheating, in our direct research on three major crises of globalization: economy, finance, environment, climate, and identity culture. This project is both comparative and interdisciplinary. Starting in late 2012, it will be completed this year, I hope.
Yes. Well, yeah,
and
sort of.
17 total. Some of his works, some of his books are As and Them in Modern Societies, 1992, Ethnicity and Nationalism, 1993-2010, and it is widely translated. Small Places, Large Issues, 1995 and 2010, widely translated also. A History on Anthropology, translated into Portuguese, but not into Portuguese from Portugal. It's Portuguese from Brazil. But even so, we can read Professor in Portuguese. And also Danish, Norwegian, Swedish. Tyranny of the Moment, Fast and Slow Time in Information Age, Globalization Studies in Anthropology, What is Anthropology, Engaging Anthropology in the Case for Public Presence, Globalization, the Key Concepts, Flag, Nation and Identity in Europe and America, Paradox of Cultural Recognition, A World of Insecurity, Frederick Barth, An Intellectual Biography, and Overheating, an Anthropology of Accelerated Change. I thank you very much that you are here with us, and we hope to learn a lot with you, and not to tire you too much, but as you see, we have all the interest in what you are going to tell us. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your far too kind introduction and for the invitation to come to this lovely city in this wonderful part of Europe. For me, it's a very welcome break from the now coming dark and cold and grim season in Scandinavia. To see a palm tree and to feel the warm sunlight is a tonic, it's life enhancing. So I'm grateful for that. I'm also grateful to have this opportunity to discuss, important things which are important to all of us, I think, as not only as academics, as scholars, but as citizens of the world. Some of the challenges facing humanity and the world. So what I'm going to do today is to develop. Yeah, that's great if you can. My approach to globalization. Now there are lots of ways of talking about globalization. Everybody, it's very hard to disagree that in fact the world is more tightly interconnected now than before. We travel more, we know more about each other. There is sort of a contagious trend of
green, believe me. Oh, you didn't like it?
Yeah, I've got some, thanks. Yeah.
The green
Of imitation and of communication, so and of trade and interdependency and so on. Everybody agrees with that. But I've got my particular take on globalization, which is what I call overheating, and that's what I'm going to talk about now, basically. And I'll end up with one of the three crises that Maria mentioned, the crisis of identity. Right, crisis of identity. Oops, that was. Let's see if the black one is more legible. The crisis of identity. We had a book out last year, which was an edited volume, co-edited with my then postdoc Elisabeth Schroeder, called Identities Destabilized. And I think destabilization is one key word when we talk about this complicated mess of identity politics and contested identities and anti-identity politics and so on. So I'll put that up as well, so that I don't forget. Destabilization. That's the fundamental destabilization. And I'm now going to spend a few minutes, maybe more, talking about where this destabilization is coming from. Destabilization. So the big metaphor, or the big concept that I'm working with in my current research on globalization is overheating, which can easily be misunderstood because people may mistakenly think that it's just about climate change, but it's not. I'll put that up here as well, overheating. It's not. It's about speed and change, and the speed of change. I mean, if you're driving a car and you're driving it too fast in a too low gear, it will eventually overheat. At least if it's an old model, the car will overheat. It will stop, and the copious amounts of black smoke will billow out of it, and you realise that you've screwed up, you've messed it up. So it overheats, and this is going to happen unless you have a cooling system which kicks in at the right time, or you shift to a higher gear, or you change the style of driving. So this is one way of thinking metaphorically about what's going on in the world today. That we're driving on this highway and we are at risk of overheating, in which case the engine will stop. Another way, metaphorical way of talking about overheating, since you're in cultural studies, you're happy with metaphors, I hope, is by saying that, okay, heat and speed in physics are two sides of the same coin. Heat and speed are interrelated. Right? Speed is one way of talking about heat. And in my part of the world, at this time of the year and for a few months to come, when we walk outside on the street and we've forgotten our gloves inside, okay? We instinctively rub our hands together like this. They warm up. And if I could do this really, really fast, my hands would eventually burn up. Right? But it doesn't happen because I have an inbuilt thermostat. That's another key term here. Thermostat, I'll put that up here. I have an inbuilt thermostat which tells a governor, which tells my body when to stop, which says this is enough. And the danger in the contemporary overheating world, which is overheating in lots of fields, and I'll give you lots of examples in a minute, is that there is no governor, there's no thermostat, there is no instance that can say that this is fine, this is enough. We now produce enough CO2, we produce enough cars, there's enough plastic in the ocean. So let's take a break. There's no instance that can say stop. So there's no thermostat. Okay. Right. So, how can I say that we live in a time of accelerated change? Now, modernity has always been about change. Change as something positive. In a sense, you could say simplistically that this is what distinguishes a modern mentality from a traditional mentality. Traditional societies are all about reproduction, about guarding the traditions, about ensuring that they are respected. Whereas with modernity, change suddenly became something potentially positive because it was associated with progress and development. Change as something good. This idea developed largely in the 18th century in Europe, but it spread across the world in the 19th century, is fundamental to the modern mindset. That change can be good. And there's been a lot of change. I mean, since the beginning of the fossil fuel era around 200 years ago. It's been massive, massive change. And yet I am saying that only in the last 20 to 25 years, since the early 1990s, it is as if acceleration has accelerated. Change is now taking place faster than before in a number of areas. So I could have had a PowerPoint, but it would have been very boring for you because all the slides would have looked the same. And they would have looked like this. Okay? Or you have quantity here and time here. So, in other words, exponential change, really fast change, is taking place now as I speak in lots of different areas. And if you don't believe me, let me give you some examples. Well, I'm saying that somehow this started in the early 1990s. I'd say around 1991 was the beginning of the current regime. Let me say a few pieces about that first, and then come to the examples, if that's okay. Why 1991? Why not 1976 or 1999? The reason is that 1991 saw the convergence of many developments that contributed to shaping the world in which we live today. The internet became commercially available. I mean, it had existed, sort of, but hardly anybody had been online before. The internet became commercially available. The new mobile phones became widespread in many parts of the world. The kind of phone that you, when it rings, you don't know where you've got it because it's so small, and you always carry it with you. And people started to begin telephone conversations by asking, "Where are you now?" Which we never did in the past, because everybody knew you were at home, because they could only phone you at home. So the new mobile telephones, which have changed our lives in ways which we still only have partly understood, right? Rendering our lives very different from what they were. So those were two technological things that happened at the same time. But 1991 also marked the final end of the Cold War. Yes, I mean, the Cold War sort of had been ending for a couple of years. But 1991 was the official end of the Cold War with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So in other words, suddenly there was only one game in town, capitalism. Capitalism was no longer just hegemonic, but it was almost universal. With the exception of a few stubborn outliers, like North Korea and Cuba and a couple of others, capitalism was now the only game in town. So the kind of world in which I grew up, which was bipolar, where you had socialism, or some version of socialism, and capitalism, as two opposing ideologies, was gone. And we were left with one hand clapping. Right? Capitalism, global neoliberalism triumphant. That's important. Remember that around this time, 1991, early 90s, also saw the deregulation of the economies in the two most populous countries in the world, China and India. Right? Deng Xiaoping's opening up took place around this time. Rajiv Gandhi in India deregulated the Indian economy, which was a revolution because it had been very close to the Indian economy in many ways. So they also became part of this global capitalist game. So this is one reason that I'm saying that 91 is a convenient year to start when we think about the acceleration of acceleration. The world became interwoven in ways which it had not been before. And this was also at the time, by the way, when the word globalization became fashionable among academics. I mean, in the early 90s, I mean, you could hardly go to a conference in social sciences or humanities which didn't have globalization, identity, and culture in the title. So this also caught on among people who did scholarly work. Okay, so in what areas have we seen this exponential growth in the last 25 years or so. I'll put this down as well for the sake of that, since I don't have PowerPoint. Okay? World trade. World trade has grown by 600% since 1980, while world GDP has grown by 250%. And in fact, that only between 2003 and 2014, you don't have to remember the years, okay? No worries, I mean, these are just, but between 2003 and 2014, the turnover in two of the world's most busiest ports, Shanghai and Singapore, doubled. It doubled in the space of 10 years. Right? So world trade, massive. And world trade, if you want to be serious about studying world trade, you have to start with the container ship. We can talk about that later if someone's interested. The shipping container, the standardization of shipping of containers, and the enormously reduced costs of transportation, which makes it perfectly economically profitable and meaningful for China to export its goods all over the world, because the transport costs have now been reduced to nearly zero compared to what they used to be before the shipping container, when you had to have hundreds of stevedores, dock workers, who had to lift things manually or with little cranes and so on and so forth. And all the crates and the boxes were of different shapes and sizes. Now everything is standardized and everything is lifted by huge cranes onto ships which are tailor-made for these particular containers. So, trade. And since I mentioned the years to 2003 and so on, energy. Now, the global consumption of energy has grown steadily since the early 19th century, with the beginning of the fossil fuel era, the beginning of exploitation of coal in a big way. But it continues, and the growth continues. And in fact, world coal exports were also doubled in the first decade of this century. You know, when I started to get interested in this, I started to get interested in mining and fossil fuels some years ago, planning to do fieldwork in Australia, which I did. Australia was the world's largest coal exporter. But then I went out and had a coffee, had some lunch, okay? And maybe a glass of wine, and came back to the office and discovered that while I'd been out having a coffee and some wine, Indonesia had become the world's largest coal exporter. Okay, I'm exaggerating a bit, but this happened very quickly. Indonesia, which had been a non-entity in the world of fossil fuels, suddenly was the world's largest exporter of coal. So coal exports. We still live in the carbon age, right? And that's one of the big contradictions of the overheated world. The contradictions of the carbon, of the dependency on fossil fuels. So energy, okay, but let's have some more sort of culturally relevant examples. Photos. These are just random examples that I'm picking out from the back of my head. Okay? I could use other examples, but imagine that only between 2010 and 2015, in the space of 5 years, the number of photos taken in the world trebled from 0.35 trillion to 1 trillion. I mean, these figures don't say anything to us, but we're talking about a very steep increase. Now, the explanation for this is very simple, because most photos are now taken with mobile phones. 80% of all photos are now taken with mobile phones. But this does not tell us, and that's where you come in, as scholars in cultural studies, does not say anything meaningful about what effects this change has on our ability to read and understand images. right? When images are everywhere, they're free, they're ephemeral, they're here now, gone in 10 minutes. So a trebling in the number of photos taken in the world in 5 years. Or we could look at tourism. I noticed at Porto airport yesterday that Porto is still a city which welcomes tourists. You know, I mean, there was a nice lady, you know, at near the exit who handed out the free maps of Porto, which is nice. Whereas in some other cities like Barcelona and Venice and in Palma de Mallorca, they've had enough. They're not demonstrating against tourists because tourists are now everywhere and they're squeezing the local population out, driving up rent, filling up the restaurants, and going around in a drunken, disorderly way in the Liverpool and Manchester United t-shirts. So you see what I mean? But tourism. In 1980, the total number of tourist arrivals in the world, international tourist arrivals, and we have fairly good statistics in this, it was 200 million. In 2012, just 30 years later, it was 1 billion. It had increased 5 times. So you realize that visiting Venice to look at the canals and so on today is a very different experience from what it would have been in 1980. Because there's, I mean, all other things being equal, there's 5 times as many. 5 times as many. Right? So tourism is a dramatic increase. 5 times increase in just a generation. Or you could, let me just give you a few other examples. I mean, in case you're not convinced that we live in a time of accelerated change, or the acceleration. Urbanisation. Mainly in the global south. In 2007, for the first time in human history, more than half of us lived in urban areas, in towns and cities. I mean, throughout most of humanity's existence, we've mainly lived in the countryside because we had to produce food. Most people had to produce food. The vast majority were farmers and fishermen, and in some cases, hunters and gatherers. And since 2007, more than half of us live in towns and cities. And this is going to continue. And as those of you from Brazil, who are from Brazil, know very well from first-hand experience, a lot of this urban development is not particularly attractive to the people who live there. We talk about, in anthropology, we're so polite, we talk about informal settlements. In journalism, one talks about slums. Okay? I mean, and this growth is uncontrollable, and it's massive. And why do people move? I mean, if you take this continent here, why do people move from the countryside to the city if there's nothing for them there other than a squalid life in a cardboard house with waterborne diseases and not much to do? Short answer is that they're being driven off the land, either by land grabbing, big companies coming, big corporations coming, or through infrastructural development, such as highways, shopping malls, or simply the sense that it's getting crowded. You know, when I was a teenager, we lived in Kenya, in East Africa. Yeah, this is Kenya. Right? In the mid-1970s. And I came back. I've been back several times, and I came back with my family in 2010. And I noticed that, yes, Nairobi was now, the capital was now a glittering sort of city with high-rise buildings and hyper-modern and Starbucks and everything you could dream of. KFC and Starbucks. And then you drive out of Nairobi, and after about 20 miles, you discover that nothing much has changed here. In village Kenya, just outside the city. Nothing much has changed. Well, the church is still in the same place, a little bit more dilapidated, but it's still there. The school is still there. Well, there's a couple of new things. There are a couple of shacks that you now find in many African villages. One shack is where the place where you can buy a top-up for your mobile phone. Okay? Crucial for many Africans. The other is a shack called Western Union, where you can receive remittances from people who live and work overseas, and that's new. And that's also saying something about the nature of globalization and the reproduction of inequality. Nothing much has changed, but one thing. There were now 4 times as many people living there in the same area as had been in 1975. So the feeling that is crowded. One reason that people are driven away from the land and into the city. Now what we see developing in West Africa, just to give just one example, I think a similar argument, but you correct me if I'm wrong, a similar argument can be made from a stretch between Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, but I'm not sure. You see now the development from Benin City in Nigeria to Accra, the capital of Ghana, covering 4 countries, right? Togo, Benin, Nigeria, plus Ghana, of a continuous stretch of informal settlements, of slums, continuous urbanized stretch along the coast of slums. And as the urbanist Mike Davis says in his book, The Planet of Slums, this may well be the highest, the largest concentration of human misery in the world today. I'm not sure if it's right. Life in an informal settlement doesn't have to be horrible, but it can be. So that's one. I mean, and I could have gone on about urban growth in the global south, but you get the point. That's also dramatic incline. Okay, so I've given a few examples now of accelerated change. I could easily give you some more. Waste. Waste, rubbish, pollution. It has been estimated by researchers now, and you may also have heard about this, because there is some attention around plastic in the oceans these days, that by 2050 there will be more plastic than fish in the sea. Okay? Unless we do something. Unless we do something. But that's where we don't have a thermostat or a governor. I mean, that's a term from cybernetics, a governor. That can sort of turn the heat down. Now it's 22 degrees, and it automatically turns off. It doesn't happen. There's no governor which can turn the heat off. Okay, so I hope now that I've convinced you that in fact acceleration has accelerated, that things are happening faster now. And we see this in the world of business and the world of mining and of industry, that new developments, new operations tend to be larger than the old ones. What was considered a big mine in Australia 30 years ago is no longer a big mine. A big mine is now about 5 times bigger, because in that way they can be more competitive and make more money. And change is affecting people's lives. And so I now move to I'm okay with time. I was a bit worried, but that's fine. I now move to the second part of the talk. Okay, first part, accelerated change since early 1990s. We see it in a number of areas, and we are facing some serious contradictions. And just to cut the argument short, one big contradiction, or what I call a double bind. A double bind is a dilemma, which is very hard to solve. It's a damned if you do, damned if you don't thing. The biggest double bind is the fact that what was our salvation for 200 years is now becoming our damnation. And it's very hard to get our head around that. And it's about growth and sustainability. Right? You can't have both. You cannot have indefinite growth. It's impossible. It's mathematically impossible. And also, we're destroying the planet. So the coal, which saved humanity, is now becoming our enemy. You see, coal and its cousins, gas and oil. Right? It saved humanity before the fossil fuel revolution in the early 19th century, which gave birth to industry and to railways and to international trade and so on and so forth, and eventually electricity, which enabled us to sit in this nice and cozy room with electric light and comfort and no smoke. The coal, it also enabled us to live much longer. Before the fossil fuel revolution, the average lifespan of a human being would be typically between 30 and 40 years. So 30 and 40 years, okay? Upper class people tended to live a bit longer, but not much. I think, you know, that's something that we don't talk about enough. It's been doubled. We now live twice as long, more. Even in poor African countries, people have a longer lifespan now than people in England would have before the fossil fuel revolution. So it's improved our health, it's improved our opportunities, it has created this wonderful, modern, complex world in which we live with all these technological gadgets and opportunities and so on and so forth. So we owe a lot to the coal, the fossil fuels. And yet, we are now realizing a couple of things. The most important being that, as I said, what was our salvation for 200 years has now become our damnation. Because we are undermining the conditions of our own existence. By producing wealth and prosperity and development and happiness, we are also producing our own unmaking through irreversible climate change and pollution. Right? So that's a big double bind. Okay? And then I shall now talk about, I'm not going into that in any more detail now because I'm going to end up with some thoughts about identity and knowledge. How to make sense of the world in a world of fake news and Twitter presidency and strange events in the world of knowledge, conspiracy theories abound, and so on. So I'm going to come back to that and relate it to some identity politics taking place these days. But before that, or as a build-up, this is a big double bind, and I'd say that the big contradiction, which is a slightly different thing because a contradiction can be resolved. The big contradiction in this rapidly changing world, I'm saying that there's fast growth and operations, be they in business or in mining or in industry, get bigger and bigger. And the big contradiction is what I call, and I'll explain through examples what I mean by it, clashing scales. Big scale needs small scale. Clashing scales, which is a typical problem of globalization, and which we need to understand if we want to make sense of the rise of these new political movements, of the Brexit movement in Britain, of the turn to extreme right-wing politics in Central and Eastern Europe, and the strange stuff that's going on in the United States. I think we need to understand clashing scales, and it's about the small scale meeting the large scale. You and I mostly live on a small scale. We have our own neighborhood, we have our relationships, our friends, our family, and so on, which are confronted with massive forces which are these days quite abstract and quite far away, which influence our lives. And nobody asked us for our opinion. Nobody asked me for my opinion. So I will then ask, and I'll put that up because that's been one of the guiding research questions in our overheating research, okay? Who can I blame? Okay? Who can I blame? And what can I do? It seemed as if it was easy in Marx and Engels' time, 1850, because you knew who the capitalist was. He was a factory owner. He had a top hat and he smoked a cigar. Okay? And you could go for him. Nowadays, who owns the gasworks in Gladstone, Australia? Well, I mean, yeah, there's a Chinese company that owns 13%. But then you have the Indians, who own 22%. And of course, the local mining company, Rio Tinto, owns about 44%. And there's no single person you can go to. And what can I do in this abstract situation? That's a clashing scale. So let me give you a few examples of clashing scales to help us understand the rise of the current very strong resentment against the establishment, and especially against established politicians and cosmopolitan intellectuals. A few examples. In Peru, in the Peruvian Andes, we've had a project, and one of my postdocs has been working there for many years, and her interest is in water. Because water is now in Peru, which is probably the most neoliberal country in South America, being turned into a commodity. Right? Water, which used to be a commons, it used to be owned by everyone, is now slowly being turned into a commodity. But that's not what I was going to say, because in recent years, rainfall and meltwater from the glaciers in the Andes has been more irregular than they used to be, more unpredictable, which creates a problem, I mean, when you have crops and livestock, right? More unpredictable. They used to have this mountain called La Conchita Blanca. It was colloquially known as La Conchita Blanca because it had this lovely white cap. And they can no longer call it La Conchita Blanca because it's gone. I mean, the mountain is still there, but it's bare. There's no snow left. So they feel the impact of climate change in that way. But at the time, some years ago, when the villagers realized that something funny was happening with the water, at the same time, a mine had opened nearby. There's so much mining in the world. I mean, I didn't know that, before I started. We hadn't expected that when I started to work on overheating. But all of a sudden, we all write about mining because it seems to be everywhere now. So then a mine had opened, and mines are notorious for using a lot of water. So the villagers, they went there, with the mayor and everything. They went to the mine and voiced their complaints and said, look, I mean, you're messing with our water. We want compensation. Either you give us money or you give us water. And they came out and they said, I mean, we're so sorry for you. We're full of sympathy, but it's not us, it's global climate change. Now the question is, what can I do if the reason that there is no more water is global climate change? You see, if they could relate directly to the mine, there would have been no clashing scales. They could have negotiated with the one with the mine about some kind of settlement. But if it's global climate change, you have these people living here in this village, struggling to make a living, and water resources are becoming scarce. And then you have climate change up there. And who do you go to at the time? I mean, I say just as a joke, and I mean, maybe you could just send an email to President Obama. I say, look, I'm Obama, you have to stop with all these CO2 emissions because it's messing up our water supply here in Cusco. Or you could send an email to the Chinese. Dear Chinese, please cool down a bit. Your industry is now growing too fast. It's overheating the world and it's ruining our water supply. You see, that sort of problem creates a sense of powerlessness. That sort of situation creates a sense of powerlessness. But in other countries as well, people feel overrun by fast changes, and they feel not being listened to. In the place where I did my fieldwork, the book is coming out in July. It's now finished, more or less, but these things take a while. So here's Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, and this is where I did fieldwork. An industrial, it's an ugly town, but it produces a lot of money, right? But it's polluted, there's coal dust everywhere, there's emissions from the alumina factory. You can't eat the fish from a harbour because it's too dirty. But it's an economically very important place, in Gladstone, where there is a small, struggling environmental group who care for the environment and who want, to have less polluted surroundings. And as you might imagine, those people are not necessarily very popular with their neighbours, because everybody makes a living from industry and they make a good living, right? So but what I was going to say is that for those environmental activists, they also feel a clash of scales within the environmental movement. So let me just give you an example of this. Greenpeace, which is the largest environmental organisation in Australia, they went on a mission along the coast in one of their ships to look at the state of the Great Barrier Reef. This famous coral reef, which goes basically down to Gladstone a little bit further. To look at, and it's dying. The Great Barrier Reef is dying, owing to a number of causes. Mainly global warming, actually. The sea is becoming too warm for the corals. So they went on a mission. And I sent them an email, because I knew the people, they were from Brisbane. And I said, so you're coming up the coast. So maybe when you come to Gladstone, we can have a coffee or something. And I said, no, we're not stopping in Gladstone. And then I spoke to those local environmental activists about this and said, wasn't that a bit, shouldn't Greenpeace be concerned with an industrial town? And they said, no, I mean, they're world champions at saving the world. They're really good at saving the world at an abstract level, right? And they can be quite good at saving the Great Barrier Reef. But they don't really care about us, concrete, tangible people living on a small scale in an industrial town. So people say, what can I do? I want to have a sustainable job. I want to have an environmentally responsible job. But if you can't give that to me, I have to continue to work for the industry. And don't blame me for that. And continue to work as a coal miner. So that's another example of clashing scales. Now, where does this lead us? Towards identity and destabilized identities and so on, and Brexit, and Trump, and right-wing populism across at least northern and eastern Europe, and virulent identity politics in Russia. There are several ways of accounting for this, for the rise of the new forms of xenophobic identity politics. And it's quite clear that something is taking place. I mean, if we take Russia, in 2005, they had an opinion poll in St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg, which is a sort of the most sort of Western-oriented, most European-oriented city in Russia. In fact, it was built by Peter the Great out the window to the west. And they had a poll where they asked people whether they felt European. And in 2005, or was it 2002? Well, anyway, early in this century, 75% said yes. 10 years later, the figure was about 40% who felt European. So they no longer identified with Europe, felt betrayed by Europe, but identified with Russia. In the Czech Republic, there are now people who organize anti-Muslim demonstrations on the street in a country where there are no Muslims. And maybe there are a few dozen, but they took 11 refugees from Syria, probably all from Christian, 11. And they still demonstrate against the Islamization of Europe. Right? In Poland, we see anti-Semitism coming up in a big way again. After having been simmering for a long time, anti-Semitism is part of the Polish tradition, unfortunately. But you see that coming up again. Again, in a country where there are very, very few Jews, because they were mostly killed or they managed to escape during the Second World War. And then you have this idea from the Twitter president about America first. You know, which he said several times during his inaugural speech, a very hostile speech, seen from the rest of the world. The idea that we should now withdraw, we should build walls. This idea of a sort of a Chinese wall, as it were, against Mexicans. Of course, it's never going to work. That sort of thing never does, because it's not the way to do it. But the very idea that we need to protect ourselves. And I only read yesterday in the newspapers that when we travel to the United States now, we must be prepared to give an interview before boarding the airplane. Have you read about that? Have you told me? Same, yeah. So they say, the airlines are a bit frustrated. They say, well, you should probably come an hour earlier. Because this boarding is going to take a little while, because everybody has to be interviewed about their intentions for visiting the United States. This paranoia, and of course the paranoia comes from somewhere. And where is it coming from? You know, the 1990s, I removed that graph anyway. The 1990s, we might say, was a positive, cheerful era in the history of contemporary globalization. And globalization seems to offer lots of opportunities for getting impulses from other cultures. Nice food, travel, brotherhood and sisterhood of humanity across boundaries, cosmopolitan ideas. It was a decade of Bill Clinton, who was a rather positive, optimistic man. So, and of course people who were into business, so lots of business opportunities in globalization. And then we moved, suddenly, almost from one day to the next, from this cheerful optimism to a paranoid vision of globalization. The paranoid vision of globalization. Paranoia. It's not a technical term, okay, but I think it's useful for this purpose. And when did this happen? Well, it happened, I'm using the European, on the 11th of September 2001. There was a shift after that, because all of a sudden the sense of predictability and security was gone. And it slowly dawned upon many people, you haven't thought about it, that when you open up, when you have a free flow of anything, you not only get a free flow of things that you approve of and you like, but you also get a free flow of horrible things, like weapons, like hatred, and violence and terrorism. Of course, the emphasis, I mean, the talk about terrorism is extremely exaggerated. Very few people are killed by terrorists. Far more people, I mean, in the United States, far more people are killed by young children with firearms than by terrorists. I mean, toddlers, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, who pick up a gun, you know, which is lying around in the house, and they accidentally shoot a member of the family. That happens more often than death by terrorism. But the idea of terrorism as a chronic and acute problem has caught hold. It's very strong, and that leads to a situation where the self-other boundary is strengthened. The self-other, us and them. All of a sudden, it becomes crucial to establish who's on our side and who's on the other side. As George Bush II memorably said, either you with us or you with the terrorists. There's no room for doubt, there's no room for ambivalence, no room for hybridity, right? Mixing. Mestizaje. There's no room for that. It's black and white. It's becoming a black and white world. So this is part of the story. Part of the story is the fear, largely manufactured, but also to some extent real, the fear of terrorism. But even, I mean, since you mentioned the trial and the terrorist attack we had in Norway, it's quite interesting to notice that in a country like Norway, which is, this is really an unofficial secret. It's just an ordinary European country. Norwegians think they're so special. But it's just an ordinary European country. And we have right-wing populists in government, in a coalition, who have a draconian and horribly inhumane immigration policy. So it's just like any other country. And we have a fair number of immigrants from all parts of the world. And a couple of 100,000 Muslims for a population of 5 million. And in that country, all the political violence we've seen in the 20th and 21st century has been carried out by right-wing extremists, by neo-Nazis, and now by this Breivik guy and by others. We've had no violent incidents, no terrorist attacks from Muslims, and yet the police continue 6 years after the right-wing extremist terrorist attack. They continue to focus almost exclusively on Islamic groups, which they suspect of not being loyal, which they suspect of being the other. Because Breivik was a lone man from the western outskirts of Oslo. He was one of us. So he couldn't be that dangerous, you know. There is something here which is interesting to look into. So that's part of the story, this paranoia. But I'd like to focus on a few other things as well, and to connect this with clashing scales. Now, Brexit. I don't think anybody had thought that they would get a majority. Just like many of the people who voted for Trump never thought that he would win. They just wanted to say fuck you to Washington. And then Hillary could be voted in with a slim margin. Alright? And the same with Brexit, I think. They just wanted to tell Westminster, to tell the Parliament that don't mess with us. Because we have a voice. And then it happened. And as you know, I mean, this is creating problems no end for Great Britain. I mean, I read The Guardian every day. And the headline, the top story, every bloody day in The Guardian is about Brexit and about all the complications involved. So they didn't really know what they were voting for and the consequences. But what were the motivations? It is often said that Brexit and the election of Trump, which are, I think, interesting events when we look at accelerated change, identity politics at this particular time. etc. Because you have other populists in power, about whom we hear less. You have Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, who's a bit of a wild man, and quite clearly fits the bill, as a populist. And you have, in a more civilized way, you have the BJP in India. I mean, a Hindu nationalist party. People were shocked when they entered the scene in the 1980s, and now nobody talks about them anymore. Right? So this has been normalized. There's a normalization of fairly extreme policies. The BJP, which is a Hindu supremacist party, has now been in power in India for many years, and nobody in the West seems to care. So that's why I'm saying etc. It's not just those, but these are two examples, two instances. Okay. So why do people vote for to leave the European Union? Because they felt overwhelmed, because they felt a clash of scales. That rules, regulations came in, lots of immigrants came in from countries like Poland, outcompeting local workers. At least that was the story. Because they could work for lower wages, or they worked longer hours, or whatever. And they felt that this was beyond control, that their world was now beyond control. And nobody would listen to them. Right? They never asked me for my opinion. All of a sudden I've got 200 Polish neighbours, and they've all got jobs, and I'm unemployed. And nobody asked me if I wanted to open the borders for massive Polish labour immigration. I mean, that sort of reasoning, or all sorts of other kinds of rules that make life difficult. And where, just as in the case of Peru, where you have to address Obama or the Chinese, who can I go to? Who can I blame? You can try your local councillor who's in your town, but he or she would say, no, I mean, it's not me, you have to speak to your member of parliament. But your member of parliament might say that, I'm sorry, I mean, this was decided in Brussels. So maybe you should go to Brussels and talk to people there and see if they can make some change. So the sense of being powerless and not being taken seriously and not being listened to is very widespread. Of course, there's another layer here, which is the self-other layer. And these are also aspects of these movements. Xenophobia, suspicion of others, a world built on paranoia and suspicion rather than openness and curiosity. I mean, these things are evolving, and we see them in lots of places. I don't know about Portugal, it may be an exception, but the boundaries, as it were, for what you can say and what you cannot say about named minorities has shifted quite rapidly in many other countries. What you can say, I mean, generalizations about Muslims, for example, quite dramatically. So that's the other layer. Of course, is to do with the suspicion of the other and the wish to stay more or less isolated, so that you can build a wall, an insurmountable wall, along the whole border with Mexico, or Britain could again, be an island, as it were, isolated, as it were, from the continent, and in charge of its own destiny. We know that in a globalized world, this is never going to work. No matter what you do, you're not going to be able to prevent this flow, this mess, this complexity of identities, of people coming in, moving in and out. But it's a dream. And part of that dream is nostalgic. That's another key term there, nostalgia. When things are happening really fast and changing really fast, and you feel that there's no control, okay? You yearn back, you yearn for a simpler time. Just as I did a few minutes ago when I mentioned at the time of Marx and Engels, everybody knew who owned the factory. So you could sort of go to him, and if you went on strike, he would feel it and so on. Nostalgia. And in the United States, I think it's fairly simple. To many people, Trump supporters, it's just a nostalgia for the time when being a white man mattered. It gave you status. Just being a white man was enough. I mean, seriously, it's because this is about gender and it's about race. And that's one of sort of the, perhaps, for cosmopolitan intellectuals hardest to defend, as it were, among Trump supporters. But they have some good points as well. They are being spoken down to. And Hillary Clinton made many mistakes during her campaign when she spoke very disparagingly and in a very arrogant way about the people who supported Trump. I mean, that's not the way to treat your citizens. So there are issues here, and he illustrated that clash of scales. We up here in Washington, we take decisions which affect you, but will never bother to come down and visit you. Just like Greenpeace never came to Lansing. But nostalgia is also part of it, and paranoia, and fear. Now finally, I see I've spoken for more than an hour now, so I should finish. I'll finish. But finally, another big question that we need to think about when we look at this new situation of identity politics, which is very polarized. It's not just destabilization. We also see a polarization in lots of countries between, you might say, the established ideas, liberal, social democratic and cosmopolitan ideas on the one hand, and the new nationalisms and the new identity politics, the withdrawal into small groups which are bounded, and the fear and contempt and suspicion of others. So where does that come from? In a certain sense, it comes from the fact that maybe, I'm just throwing this out, I haven't done any proper research on it. Maybe we live increasingly in different worlds. I mean, you can spend your whole day just reading about climate change. So to you, that's the only thing that matters. Or you can spend your whole day just reading about migration. And depending on your sources, either you'll be suspicious of the migrants, or you'll be sympathetic to them, depending on which sources you choose. So people tend to live in different worlds. The term echo chamber is sometimes used to talk about in the Facebook and the way people get information on the internet. In the past, before we got our information on the internet, typically a family would subscribe to a newspaper, and the newspaper contained all sorts of stuff, also news about everything. You had to read about everything, and some things you disagreed with, and some things you learned. Sometimes you learned something, but you got a broad spectrum of views and news. Whereas nowadays, it seems as if this is becoming far more segregated. Where do people get their information from? And one question that people also ask, which is what I'm looking at now, but it's too early to conclude, okay, is who can I trust? When it comes to knowledge, who should I listen to? Who provides reliable knowledge that I can believe in? There's a movement, a small movement, I'd say, in some parts of Europe against academic research on migration because it is accused of being polite, politically correct, and not telling us the truth. Not telling us the truth. So you have a counter movement. There are people who produce alternative facts, right, and alternative figures, and which become hugely popular, and which are far more widely read than the academics' products. So who can I trust? What kind of knowledge can I trust? And how should I orient myself in this rapidly changing world? We see that conspiracy theories are becoming popular. You know, I mean, and they exist not only on the right but also on the left. A typical left-wing conspiracy theory is about 9/11 haven't been an inside job. And it still chugs on, you know, there are still people who produce stuff within that field and produce what they call evidence to prove it. Okay, I'll end now, but we can discuss anything that I've spoken about, but I'm ending here. Not only are identities destabilized, but knowledge is also being destabilized. The classic authority of the expert, of the seasoned, experienced politician, or the professional journalist, or the researcher, or the professor, that sort of knowledge is being undermined because of the feeling that there are some clashing scales here. They don't see us. They may see the big picture, but they don't see us. And because these ways of producing knowledge allegedly are funded by particular interests. So just one final anecdote from Gladstone, Queensland, where there is a lot of research going on pollution, because it's a very polluted place. So you have the people who are funded by the mining company to do that research, or who are funded by the Ports Corporation, which is also powerful in Gladstone, big port. And then you have the people who just come from the University of Sydney, or from some other independent research institute. And they produce completely different conclusions, because they measure the quality of the water in different ways. I mean, the people who are funded by the Ports Corporation, who want to prove that the water is actually quite clean, they just measure the water when there's a high tide, because then clean water comes in, you know, from the ocean, from the Pacific. And those who measured the quality of the air for the alumina factory, they also made sure to measure the quality of the air at particular times during the day when they knew that the wind was blowing in a certain direction. So what my informant said, I mean, several of them, when I came to do research, they said, well, so who pays for your research? I mean, that's a very, very good question. Because had I said, well, you know, it's Queensland government or it's Rio Tinto, they might not have wanted to talk to me. But luckily I could say that I have money from Brussels, from Europe, and it's nothing to do with the local. And one of the others said, I still trust science, but I no longer trust scientists. That's also interesting. A very sort of intelligent thing to say in this kind of setting. So that's where we are. How can we see destabilization of identities and of knowledge? When we get our knowledge from very different sources, we sometimes get the feeling that we live in different worlds. And this is one of the effects of the accelerated changes that I spoke about in the beginning of the lecture. Fast change, a new communication regime where hegemony has been lost by the traditional leaders, and a situation where there is a lot of uncertainty and fear about the future. When did you last hear a politician speak about hope? Right? They speak about fear. They try to sell us fear. If you don't vote for us, the terrorists are going to come and get you. Which is not a very upbeat and not a very modern mindset, because modernity is also about being positive about the future. Okay, so I finished then, and
okay.
We can now discuss anything you like.
Okay, thank you very much. So now we are going to listen to your comments, questions. I appreciate, I'm sure all of us appreciate a lot your very clear and pedagogical talk. You are really a teacher. We can understand everything. You're a great teacher, indeed. And I'm sure there's lots of questions and doubts, and maybe professor has not all the answers, but we can think together, we can ask together, and now it's your turn. Thank you very much, Professor, for your brilliant, excellent comments. So,
do you think that globalization can be the end of our race?
Humanity?
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, like, for example, the economic crisis, we are so dependent of other countries. For example, I don't know, but I think that 50 years ago, for example, the fall of the Lehman Bank
Yes.
wouldn't be so important in other economies.
no.
That's why I'm asking this.
Yeah, it's a good question. And the interconnectivity and the mutual dependence is also evident now in the Brexit negotiations. Because, I mean, it slowly sort of dawns upon people in Britain how dependent they are on all kinds of arrangements they have with the other member countries, and how difficult it is to extricate yourself from them. But I would say that it is not unthinkable. I mean, I'm not for the sort of the doom and gloom scenarios. I mean, it's not in my nature, but still, I mean, one does have the right to be a little bit worried. And one reason is that the complexity of what we do to the planet is such that nobody knows the consequences. A term which has been proposed, and most of you probably have heard, which I think is quite useful to describe this particular era, is the Anthropocene, right? The Anthropocene. Which as a geological era refers to the time when the human footprint can be felt everywhere on the planet, even where there hasn't been any humans, because of climate change or pollution or industrial fallout or whatever. So even in the depths of the Amazon forest or in the white desert of the Antarctic, you can notice the human footprint. And what this does to us and to the planet in the long run, nobody knows. But I read only recently that 75% of the insects were gone from a big German national park. 75% of the insects were gone. And it is already widely known that bees are struggling. Bees which are crucial, for pollinating fruit trees and all sorts of flowering plants. Without the bees, I couldn't have any apples and pears in my garden. But it's much more serious than that. So, in other words, we are extremely vulnerable. And we are running out of some resources as well, non-renewable resources. And that's why I'm saying there's no governor, there's no thermostat. There is only, and the accelerated changes taking place in the world are not driven by a political project, but by profit-seeking corporations. Who don't take that sort of responsibility. So yeah, it's risky, it's exciting. At least we don't live in a boring century. We have enough challenges.
Not at all. Okay. Thank you.
I also
You want to?
I found very, very interesting and fascinating your presentation because you took an approach that showed us how at least indicate and suggest that things are not that disciplines, they are far more interlinked. And you said that some people can spend all their day studying climate change, and others studying migrations. And these two groups, they might not understand the linkages between the two, but they are quite interlinked.
Yes.
And my question goes to the double blind you talked about.
Yes.
Some people nowadays I have been reading about this, authors as Hylland, French researcher. He talks about green growth, possibilities of overcoming the dangers of negative effects of growth by using innovative technologies and those kinds of things. But I think that even if this green growth is possible, it is not possible for all countries the same, because some countries are specialized. For instance, African countries and South American countries are specialized on these fossil fuels extractive industries.
Yes.
So there is a kind of unfairness and injustice at the global level, because the countries that are richer, they become richer at the cost of other countries that were exploring these fossil fuels to, it's not give, but to sell the countries from northern countries to get richer.
Yes.
And now some countries have the possibility to innovate and to become almost free from the climate change effect. Not free, but more, they are more apart. And others, for instance, our country and others, are kind of victims of this effect of growth. So how do you see in the present and in the long term the effects of climate change in the global community? Will there be more migrations? How will it?
Yes.
How do you see this?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. It's a big question, and thank you. Thank you also for bringing up the subject of global inequality, which is crucial there. I mean, if you look at almost any of these large-scale processes, be it the expansion of Chinese mining operations across Africa, or the effects of climate change through droughts and flooding. I mean, the poor people have to foot the bill. It's always like that. They have to foot the bill. Did you notice? I mean, even in the United States, where Puerto Rico is it's a kind of a stepchild of the United States, because it is and it isn't part of the country. And it contains lots of people who are non-white and Spanish speaking. So Trump spoke very disparagingly. He said, you've got to get your act together. We can't give you help forever in Puerto Rico after the island had been devastated by a hurricane. Whereas he was all for giving help to people in Florida and Texas. So there is a racial dimension here, and also a dimension which is to do with global inequality, which we certainly shouldn't forget. When it comes to your question about technology, there are several schools here. I mean, some would say that. I would say that no. I'm not among the optimists, I'm afraid, because one of the things that I've been doing in my spare time is to collect unintended consequences of modernity. So everything we do has unintended consequences. And when you produce a car, you also produce pollution and traffic accidents. And when you produce green energy, it turns out that you need rare minerals, for solar panels and so on. So I'm not sure. I think my recipe would rather be to in the rich part of the world, to slow down and cool down and scale down. Slow down, cool down, and scale down in the rich part of the world. In the poorer parts of the world, things look rather different. So let me just say that, I mean, as an extension of your question, one of my PhD students just submitted his thesis, very happy for him. He did fieldwork in Sierra Leone in West Africa, next to Liberia. Sierra Leone was ravaged by a civil war, a horrible civil war, over diamonds and mining and money and power, with foreign and local interests involved for many years. They finally emerged out of that war, and the country was opened up for investors. And some people came in, some Chinese in fact, and others came in to invest. And so all of a sudden, the clump of jungle that used to be on the other side of this river was gone, and instead there was a biofuel plantation. And then you look inside and you see the people are working there, they're not European, but they don't look African either. And you realize that they're Chinese. And it happened almost from one day to the next. And then you ask a guy, and the anthropologist comes up to a guy and asks, so, what do you think about this? Jungle's gone, there's a biofuel plantation. And he just shrugs and says, well, man, it's global, it's progress. We're becoming modern now. And they're all too happy to be overrun. because it can give them a job. Right? They're fine with being overrun by large-scale interests because it can give them a job. So we mustn't forget that dimension either. That if you live in poverty, alienation is not the sort of the top of a list of priorities. It's survival.
So your topic was very so clear and so comprehensive. I would like to ask you something which is not exactly in line with what is a bit different from what has been asked. How would you relate so independent movements in Europe in the last, which have increased in the last decade, to the big picture that you have given us?
Thank you. You're thinking about Scotland, Catalonia.
Catalonia, Scotland. Well, there are independence movements. Well, in other. Well, in other countries.
Yes. Well, I mean, yes. Sort of before I started to work on overheating, I would have given a very simple answer. And I might have said, you could say that, okay, there are several ways of asserting your identity. If you want to be seen as a group, if that's important for you, because your identity is associated with a group. I must say, I mean, my ethnic identity, I think, is social anthropology, or something like that. But many people feel like they need that sort of group based on common origins, culture, food, and so on. In Britain, there are three ways of doing it. You have the political in Scotland, where you have a strong independence movement. They want their own country. Then you have the cultural in Wales, where they want support for the theatre, for the language training, and media in Welsh and so on. But where there's no ambition to form a Welsh state. And then you have Cornwall in the southwestern tip of England, where the Cornish identity, which also is Celtic, but they no longer have language. They lost that a couple of hundred years ago, but they have a strong Cornish identity. So you have the political, the cultural, and in Cornwall it's commercial. They try to sell all sorts of stuff as Cornish coffee, Cornish ice cream. I mean, lots of rubbish. They have, Cornish pasties and so on. So these are the three ways of asserting your identity with different political implications of the centre. When it comes to these independence movements, well, I think they fit into the general, you might say, the feeling that we have clashing scales, that the powers that be are too distant and they don't care about us because we are the periphery. So we need to get out and to rule our own, as it were, house. So I'm not sure if I would say that it's a direct result of overheating, but it certainly is a result of this crisis of legitimacy that we see in many parts of Europe. But it fits in, it's a form of identity politics. And it is a way of relinquishing, you might say, the cosmopolitan ideals of, if you think about nations as being nations can be many different things. It can be based on citizenship, or it can be based on something ethno-cultural origins. So we see a shift in some parts of the world. Some parts of the world, like Brazil, seems to be vaccinated against that, luckily. So we still have a few beacons of hope in the new world. But in the old world, we see this in so many places. Nativism, okay, as a term. In Africa, same thing. There's increased suspicion against foreign workers in South Africa from other African countries. I mean, you can't call it racism because they're all black, but there's xenophobia against people from Nigeria and Zimbabwe. And nativism as a response to this swirl of change. Security, tradition, boundaries, us and them. You know who's inside, you know who's outside. None of these grey zones nations can be two things, as I said. Republican, based on where you live, on citizenship, rights and duties, go back to where your parents were born. That was the idea of Spain. If it hadn't been messed up by Madrid. That's another story. And on something ethno-cultural. And you see the drift now towards the ethno-cultural idea of the nation in many parts of the world, in the old world. See it in China. I was just in China. See it there. That there's a great polarization between the majority and the minorities. But the minorities feeling that they're getting a bad deal, and they respond through quests for more autonomy and perhaps even independence.
Okay, now the last questions, because it's really too much for Professor.
No, I'm fine.
Last questions, and maybe 1, 2, 3, and I'm asking you to ask them all, and then
Okay.
Professor Thomas will answer them all.
I just have to find something to. I have to
Yes,
make
it's
it
better, because if not, you are going to be here 1 hour or 2 hours more, and
Yeah.
you know, you are going to be just.
So my question has to be with the growing population of the world. We are many, humankind is huge, but also we are old. Our population in the West at least is very old, so we are kind of dying and not birthing enough people. So is that going to be good in the future for like climate changes and I don't know, pollution and everything? Like we are younger and we have more studies and knowledge and all that stuff, so maybe that's going to be a positive outcome for the dying old population.
Okay. Second one, please.
I was also wondering about what would your opinion be on NASA's and SpaceX projects on colonizing Mars?
Sorry,
Colonizing Mars.
Oh, yeah.
Planet Mars. It's not just science fiction topic. And would that be just a symptom of overheating, or more like a positive thing? A positive thing to think about in the next decade, Mars as an escape plan or more like.
Okay, thank you.
I have a very good question. You talked about the us and them divide and all of that phenomenon in Europe, mainly against the non-European other. But do you think this also relates to inside of Europe, that all of these us and them dynamics are also becoming evident inside of the European context? Europeans against other Europeans.
Yes.
Certainly.
Thank you. Great question. So I'll start with the last one on the various forms of xenophobia. I think when we look at identities and boundaries, one thing that hasn't been researched properly or well enough is the fact that there are different degrees of otherness. Right? I mean, some people are more other than others. So that in my country, in Norway, if you come from Sweden, you're not really foreign. We can understand each other. We share very much the same sort of way of life. And and same with people from Denmark, even though they're a bit more German, but still. And then you have Protestants Northern Europe, Britain, Germany, so on. Not really very different. In the past, there used to be some resentment against people from Southern Europe, especially Italians. There were notions about Italians that being mafiosi and taking all our young girls, and that's gone now. So there's hardly any stigma, but yet more different. Catholic, Romance language, different family organization, and then people from Eastern Europe, from Poland. I mean, the largest group from Eastern Europe working now in Western Europe. A bit more different again. Russians, even more. And then the big boundary now is not, as it used to be, with black people, but with Muslims. If you're Muslim, you're other. And if you're Muslim and black, like Somalis, it's going to be very hard for you to be accepted. It's going to be very hard for you to be integrated. So yes, I mean, in the UK, keep in mind that around the Brexit propaganda and all the fake news that was produced by the tabloid press around Brexit, all the false facts and lies that they produced in order to make people vote for Brexit. There was not very much about Muslims, nothing about Indians. Indians in Britain are quite well integrated. Many of them are middle class, educated and so on, but about people from Poland. It was the Poles, it was the internal migration in the European Union they wanted to stop. So yes, we're probably going to see that as well. But which shape it takes, I don't know. But that depends also on the sort of the internal, you might say, semantics of the identity and how it relates to others, as foreign or not. Now the question about colonizing Mars. To me, it's a nice idea, but not a good one. I distinguish between nice ideas and good ideas. To me, it's still an idea of science fiction, and it's not going to save us. There are too many obstacles, too many difficulties. I doubt it's ever going to be viable, feasible, to have a human civilization on Mars. I will certainly not live there myself. But I heard about someone who had volunteered. You could volunteer to take part in one of those first missions.
They're already recruiting volunteers.
Yeah. And there was one guy I read about, and he said, sorry?
It's supposed to happen in like 8 years.
Yeah.
There are plans.
Yeah, but people could already enlist. And there was one who was interviewed, and he said, I'm fed up, I'm done with this planet. And personally, I'm not done with this planet. I feel it's my responsibility, our collective responsibility to leave it in as good an order or even better than we found it in. So that would be my take. And also high-tech, as I said, high-tech solutions can be very risky, very dangerous. In order to combat climate change, the same people, Elon Musk and that sort of gang, technological optimists, they have proposed, for example, to spray a kind of dust in the stratosphere, in the low stratosphere, in order to reduce or to weaken the sun rays, in order to slow down global warming. And that sort of thing is incredibly dangerous, because talking about crushing scales, if it fails, it's going to affect us all. And nobody asked me if I thought this was a good idea. So I'm a bit worried. I think we need to think in a different way. Decentralize, scale down. Think more locally in terms of the economy, and more globally in terms of human values. So, and then the big question, the big elephant in the room, population. It's in here. I haven't forgotten it. Population is here, okay, in the book. It was just somehow too big to take on here. Yes, that's the most spectacular, of course, exponential growth curve we've had. And the one that you're most accustomed to seeing is that of population growth. And again, fossil fuels, it explains it. Before 1820, it took us 200,000 years to reach 1 billion. Right? And then it took us just another 100 years to reach 2 billion. And after that, 100 years to reach 7.5 billion. So quite clearly, in some parts of the world, there is relative overpopulation, in the sense that there aren't enough resources, there aren't enough jobs to go around. What does it help in Pakistan to have economic growth of 3% if the population growth is 4.5%? And there are no jobs for the young. And remember that in the global south, the situation is opposite of what you described for the global north. They don't have an aging population. We have an age pyramid which looks almost like this in many countries. Nigeria, Niger, or Pakistan, and so on. Whereas our pyramids look sort of more like, and we have lots of 8-year-olds and so on. It's more like this, and with shrinking, with shrinking numbers of children. Is it going to be good or bad? We're going to see. That's my prediction. What we have seen in terms of migration, the Syrian refugee crisis, and so on, is only a foretaste of things to come. And the Syrian refugee crisis, by the way, can also be connected to climate change. There have been droughts for several years in rural areas. So So people moved in, many people moved into the cities, to Damascus, to Aleppo, and so on. Were met with little sympathy by Assad's regime and little support, which made them, in many cases, easy prey for insurgents, whether ISIS or more secular or ethnic insurgent groups. So there is a connection that can be made there. Climate refugees. I mean, Bangladesh, one of the most densely populated countries in the world, is on its way to becoming uninhabitable. Salinization of the salination of the soil, making agriculture difficult, impossible, so on. There are countries like Nigeria, where the population is still, booming. I mean, it's flattening out in many other countries, and it's going down in some countries. So we'll see a reshuffling of the world's population quite clearly, and there will be an exodus again from Africa. I mean, I'm pretty sure of that. When, I don't know, but we're going to have to deal with it. We have to find a way of dealing with it, and it may be ugly, but it doesn't have to be. What was the final thing I was going to say? I had something interesting to say. I'm sorry about something I thought was interesting anyway about population. How to see declining, growing population, the aging population of the global north. Yes, it's about nationalism, because you see, most world leaders feel that we should have a thermostat. We should say that, okay, 8 billion is enough, 9 billion is enough. Let's now reduce, maybe. Either we reduce or we stop using so much energy, and we start, living simpler lives. With less facilities, less traveling, less air traffic, less tourism, less gadgets. Then we can be 9 or 10 or 11 billion. But nobody does that. But many politicians feel that, and leaders and intellectuals, although they may not say it aloud because it's a little bit taboo, that there's enough of us. We shouldn't grow anymore. But when it comes to your own country, it's always a source of worry, the aging population. Everybody else should reduce the population, but not we. So in Germany, in Italy, in Russia, in Japan, which are some of the countries which see this sort of dip, that you have an aging and slightly declining population, there's a lot of worry about that. We should be more. There should be more Japanese, but fewer of everybody else. Which also shows some of the limitations of a nationalist mindset when the challenges we are facing are global and have to be dealt with collectively.
Thank you very much. I want, for all your effort, for your so clear answers, so deep reflection, I want to ask our director of the research center of our department, come here and say the last word and we'll close the session, please. Professor Teresa Cortes. Because this is an organization that was sponsored and
sorry, I came late, so those are my first words. Thank you so much for coming and for this wonderful talk, and for collaborating with the doctoral program in cultural studies. And I see there's so much public, so your theme is really very attractive theme and very actual in current days. And I hope that the next sessions will work well, and that the students profit from your presence here and from your advice.
Thank you. Thank you. Looking forward to that. Thank you.